Imagine pulling into a gas station late at night. The cool hum of the fluorescent lights above, the faint smell of gasoline in the air, and all you're thinking about is topping off your tank before heading home. That was Marcus Williams' only thought as he pulled up to the pump in his sleek black sedan, still dressed in the sharp suit and tie he had worn to a charity dinner earlier that evening. He looked like any successful professional, calm, collected, and clearly just on his way home. But what happened in the next few minutes would change his night entirely, and it would soon set up one of the most jaw-dropping twists you could ever imagine. Marcus had just started filling his tank when he noticed a patrol car roll slowly into the lot. At first, he didn't think much of it. After all, police cruisers stop at gas stations all the time. But then the car didn't move on. It stopped directly behind him, cutting off his exit. Within seconds, red and blue lights flashed, reflecting off his windows, and 2 officers stepped out, walking quickly toward him. "Sir, what are you doing here?" one of them barked. Marcus blinked in disbelief. "I'm buying gas. Is there a problem, officer?" To anyone else, this would have sounded absurd. A man in a suit standing at a pump with his credit card still inserted, explaining the obvious. But the officers didn't treat it like that. They exchanged a look, and one of them circled around his car with a flashlight, shining it through the windows. "You look suspicious." "We've had reports of loitering around here," the other officer said, his tone sharp, almost rehearsed. Marcus tried to keep his voice steady. "I'm just getting gas. I'm on my way home." But instead of acknowledging his explanation, the officers pressed harder. They asked for his license, registration, proof of insurance. Marcus handed everything over without hesitation, even showing them his work badge that identified him as a judge, a respected man in the community who had spent decades serving the very system these officers represented. They barely glanced at it. One officer chuckled under his breath. "Yeah, sure. Everyone's a judge these days." Marcus felt the sting of humiliation hit him like a punch to the chest. He could see a few people at the other pump staring, whispering, and even pulling out their phones. To them, it looked like a routine police stop. To Marcus, it was something deeper, an experience he knew too many people who looked like him had endured. The difference was, tonight he was the target. The officers ordered him out of the car. He complied, keeping his hands visible, knowing that the wrong move, the wrong word, could escalate everything. His heart pounded, not out of guilt, but out of frustration and disbelief. He thought of his years on the bench, presiding over cases where officers had defended their actions, explaining away accusations of racial profiling and overreach. And here he was, living that reality firsthand. One officer pressed him against the hood of his own car, patting him down roughly as though he were a dangerous suspect. The cold metal of the vehicle dug into his chest. He tried to speak calmly, but his voice cracked with anger. "This is unnecessary. I've told you who I am." They ignored him. The cuffs clicked around his wrists, sharp and tight, the sound echoing louder in his ears than the traffic passing by on the street. For a moment, Marcus felt a flood of emotions, embarrassment, anger, disbelief. But more than anything, he felt powerless. A man who had spent years upholding the law was suddenly reduced to nothing more than a stereotype in the eyes of the very people sworn to protect. As they shoved him into the back of the cruiser, Marcus stared out at the gas station, his car abandoned by the pump, the nozzle still hanging. He caught sight of a teenager recording the entire scene on a phone, and part of him felt grateful. At least there would be proof. At least someone would see the truth. But inside that car, he sat in silence, his mind racing. How many others had sat in this same position, without the chance to clear their names, without the power to fight back? How many people had gone through this exact humiliation, night after night, without anyone ever knowing? For Marcus, the night was a brutal reminder that no amount of success, no title, no robe or gavel could shield him from prejudice in the moment. To those officers, he wasn't a respected judge. He wasn't a community leader. He was just a black man at a gas station. And that was enough for them to treat him as guilty before proven innocent. What those officers didn't realize was that this man's life was about to intersect with theirs in a way they could never have predicted. Because while Marcus sat in that cruiser, silently fuming and humiliated, tomorrow was already waiting. And tomorrow, the roles would be reversed. The hours Marcus spent at the police station felt like an eternity. He was placed in a small cold room with a single metal chair and a table that looked like it had seen decades of interrogations. The fluorescent light above flickered now and then, adding to the discomfort. He had done nothing wrong, yet he was being treated like a suspect in a crime no one could name. An officer came in, sat across from him, and began asking questions that felt more like accusations. Where were you before the gas station? Who were you meeting with? Why were you driving around that late at night? Marcus answered calmly, but inside he felt his patience thinning. Each question was another reminder that these men didn't see him as a man in a suit, or a community leader, or even a husband and father heading home. They only saw someone to be suspicious of. When Marcus explained again that he was a judge, the officer smirked. If you were really a judge, you wouldn't be sitting here, would you? That line cut deep, not because Marcus needed validation, but because it showed how far their disbelief went. They couldn't imagine that someone who looked like him could hold that kind of authority. Hours passed. They searched his car without cause, flipping through his briefcase, checking the trunk, even lifting the mats as if they expected to find drugs or weapons hidden away. All they found were court papers, neatly stacked, and a binder with his initials embossed on the cover. Still, they didn't let him go. By the time the clock crept past midnight, Marcus sat back in that chair staring at the wall, wondering how many others had broken down in this very room, ordinary citizens who didn't have the power or voice to fight back. The humiliation wasn't just about the handcuffs or the cold tone of their voices. It was about being stripped of dignity, reduced to nothing more than a body in a chair, waiting for someone else to decide if you were worthy of freedom. Finally, after what felt like forever, another officer entered and dropped a folder on the table. We didn't find anything. You're free to go. His tone was casual, dismissive, as if Marcus had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience in their shift. No apology, no acknowledgement of the mistake, just the cold announcement that he could leave. Marcus stood up slowly, his wrists still sore from the cuffs. He picked up his belongings, the contents of his briefcase shoved back in hastily, his ID carelessly tossed on top. As he walked out of the station, he could feel the eyes of the officers behind him. Some looked smug, others indifferent. Not one seemed to recognize the weight of what they had done. Driving home, the silence in the car was almost suffocating. He kept replaying the night in his head, the flashing lights, the mocking laughter, the sound of those cuffs locking into place. Every detail stung. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, reminding himself to breathe. But beneath the frustration was something else. Reflection. He thought about the countless cases he had presided over, where citizens testified about being profiled, disrespected, or treated unfairly. He thought about how many times officers had sat in his courtroom and defended their actions with phrases like reasonable suspicion or standard procedure. Tonight, Marcus had lived that experience firsthand, and it was more demeaning than words could capture. What struck him most was the sheer imbalance of power. In that gas station parking lot, in that interrogation room, nothing he said mattered. His identity, his achievements, his reputation, all of it was invisible to them. In their eyes, he was guilty until proven otherwise. And what saved him in the end wasn't truth or fairness. It was simply that they found nothing to hold him on. By the time Marcus pulled into his driveway, the sky was beginning to lighten. Exhaustion weighed heavy on him, but sleep was impossible. He sat in his living room, staring at the robe hanging in his closet, the black robe he wore every day in court. It symbolized justice, order, authority. Yet just hours earlier, none of that had mattered. He realized then that what happened to him wasn't just about him. It was about every person who had been silenced, overlooked, or wrongly accused. He had felt their pain, their anger, their helplessness. And now, more than ever, he understood his responsibility as a judge. Marcus knew the next day he would walk into his courtroom as he always did. But what he didn't know yet was that fate was about to hand him a moment of poetic justice so powerful that it would not only shake those two officers, it would send a message across the city. Because sometimes, life has a way of flipping the script. And the very people who once held the power would soon find themselves on the other side of the bench, staring up at the man they thought they could dismiss. Morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the courthouse, as Marcus straightened his robe and prepared to step into his courtroom. On the outside, he looked calm, professional, every bit the dignified judge he had been for years. On the inside, however, the events of the previous night still burned in his memory like fresh wounds. He reminded himself that today was a new day, another docket of cases waiting, another chance to uphold the law he had sworn to protect. He glanced at the case list before entering and froze. His eyes scanned the names once, then again, as if he couldn't believe what he was reading. The two officers who had arrested him, mocked him, and treated him like a criminal the night before, were scheduled to appear in his courtroom that morning. They weren't defendants in a minor traffic case. No, this was far more serious. They were facing multiple complaints of misconduct, filed by several citizens who had accused them of racial profiling, unnecessary force, and abuse of authority. For a moment, Marcus simply stared at the names. The irony was almost surreal. Less than 12 hours earlier, those same men had looked down on him, laughed at his claim of being a judge, and cuffed him like a suspect. And now here they were, about to stand trial in his courtroom under his authority, with him holding the gavel. It felt like fate itself had written this script. When the bailiff opened the doors and announced, "All rise for the Honorable Judge Marcus Williams," the room came alive with the shuffle of people standing. Marcus walked in with steady steps, his face unreadable. But his eyes quickly found the two men at the defense table. The officers who had arrested him the night before looked up and locked eyes with him. And in that instant, their expressions told the whole story. Shock, recognition, regret. Their faces drained of color. The smug confidence they carried the night before had vanished. They shifted uncomfortably in their seats, whispering to their attorney, stealing nervous glances toward the bench. They knew, they remembered, and they realized just how drastically the power dynamic had changed overnight. The courtroom buzzed quietly, as if the entire audience could sense something unusual about this case. Marcus took his seat, adjusted his glasses, and with a firm rap of the gavel, called the session to order. His voice was calm, steady, but behind every word was a weight of authority the officers could not escape. The proceedings began with the prosecution presenting evidence. One by one, witnesses took the stand. A young man described being pulled over without cause, searched, and humiliated by the same officers. A middle-aged woman testified about being intimidated during a routine traffic stop. Another man recounted how he had been shoved against a wall and questioned aggressively while simply walking home from work. As each story was told, the pattern became clearer. This wasn't about one mistake or one misunderstanding. It was about a repeated abuse of power, a disregard for the very principles of fairness and justice. Marcus listened intently, asking precise, thoughtful questions. He gave each witness the respect and dignity he himself had been denied the night before. Across the room, the two officers sat stiffly, their nerves unraveling with each passing minute. They avoided looking directly at Marcus, but every so often their eyes flickered toward him, full of silent desperation. It was almost as if they wanted to plead, to say they hadn't meant what they did, to explain themselves. But there was nothing they could say now that could erase the truth. The irony was heavy in the air. Just hours earlier, these men had the power to decide Marcus's fate. They had chosen arrogance over restraint, humiliation over respect. Now the roles were reversed, and they were on the receiving end of the justice system they had misused. Yet Marcus didn't gloat. He didn't remind them of the night before. He didn't let emotion seep into his role. Instead, he embodied the very principles of fairness they had abandoned. His demeanor was professional, controlled, and precise. He wasn't there for revenge. He was there for justice, and the courtroom could feel it. The spectators whispered among themselves, sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding. Some even recognized Marcus from local news stories and community events. The idea that these officers had once dismissed him as just another black man was unthinkable now. As the testimonies piled up, the weight of evidence grew impossible to ignore. By the time the defense finally had its turn, the officers looked exhausted, their lawyer scrambling to poke holes in stories that rang with consistency and truth. The contrast between the witnesses, ordinary citizens with little to gain, and the defendants, Uniformed men caught in a web of their own misconduct, was stark. Through it all, Marcus sat with unwavering composure, presiding over the hearing with the very authority the officers had doubted he possessed. Every time he spoke, every ruling he made, the irony deepened. The same voice they had mocked was now the one determining their future. The longer the hearing went on, the clearer it became to everyone in the room. Justice wasn't blind today. Justice could see very well, and it had brought the two officers face to face with the consequences of their own actions. By the time Marcus called for a short recess, the air in the courtroom was thick with tension. The officers leaned in toward their lawyer, whispering frantically, their confidence shattered. And as Marcus stepped out of the courtroom, robe flowing behind him, he carried with him the knowledge that this moment was more than personal. It was symbolic. It was history turning in real time, the scales of justice balancing in the most unexpected way imaginable. The courtroom settled back into silence as the recess ended, and everyone waited for Judge Marcus Williams to return. When he stepped through the door and took his seat at the bench, the room stood again, the weight of his presence undeniable. The two officers at the defense table shifted nervously, straightening their uniforms, as if the crisp fabric could somehow restore their authority. But nothing could erase the reality. They were no longer in control. The hearing resumed with more witnesses. One by one, citizens came forward, each telling a story that carried the same painful theme: harassment, intimidation, and humiliation at the hands of the very officers who now sat trembling. A young college student described how he was pulled over on his way home from class, forced to sit on the curb for nearly an hour, while the officers searched his car for drugs they never found. His voice cracked as he explained how helpless he felt, surrounded by flashing lights, while strangers slowed down to stare as though he were a criminal. Then came a mother of two, who broke down in tears as she recounted being stopped in front of her children. She had been accused of rolling through a stop sign, but instead of a warning or a simple ticket, the officers shouted at her, demanding she step out of the car. Her children sat crying in the back seat, terrified, as the officers pressed her against the vehicle to make sure she wasn't hiding anything. Nothing was found, but the trauma left its mark not only on her, but on her children, who now flinched every time they saw flashing lights. Each story landed like a blow in the courtroom. The spectators sat forward in their seats, captivated by the steady stream of testimony. The officer's lawyer objected often, trying to discredit the witnesses, but each objection was met with Marcus's calm, firm rulings. He wasn't swayed by theatrics. He wasn't distracted by legal games. He focused on the truth, and the truth was painting a picture that was impossible to ignore. When the prosecution introduced video evidence from a bystander's phone, the tension peaked. The footage showed the officers during another late-night stop, raising their voices, surrounding a man who kept insisting he had done nothing wrong. Their tone was mocking, dismissive, almost identical to the way they had treated Marcus the night before. Gasps rippled through the room as the video played. The officers' own actions, once shielded by darkness and excuses, were now exposed in the bright light of the courtroom. Throughout it all, Marcus sat with unwavering composure. His face betrayed no anger, no hint of personal vendetta, but his eyes were sharp, following every word, every detail. He was living proof of the difference between authority used responsibly and authority abused. His restraint in that moment was more powerful than any outburst could have been. The defense finally called the officers to testify. Their voices were noticeably quieter than they had been in the past. Their confidence cracked. They claimed their actions were part of standard procedure. They argued that their job required quick judgment, and that sometimes innocent people got caught in the process. But their words fell flat. Compared to the raw, emotional stories of the witnesses and the undeniable video evidence, their explanations sounded hollow, rehearsed, and defensive. And though Marcus remained professional, the irony hung over the room like a heavy shadow. The officers were explaining themselves to the very man they had handcuffed, mocked, and dismissed as just another suspect. Their excuses carried little weight in the presence of someone who had personally experienced their behavior only a day earlier. By now, the spectators knew they were witnessing something extraordinary. Whispers moved quietly through the rows of benches. people exchanging glances as if to say, "Can you believe this?" It wasn't just a case anymore. It was a moment of poetic justice unfolding in real time. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his voice steady as he addressed both sides, asking pointed questions that cut through the fog of excuses. He asked the officers why so many complaints had been filed against them in such a short time. He pressed them on why their actions often escalated situations instead of calming them down. His questions weren't loud or dramatic, but they carried the weight of undeniable truth. Every word reminded the courtroom of what justice was supposed to look like: measured, fair, but unshakably firm. As the day stretched on, the officers' shoulders sagged under the mounting evidence. Their lawyer's voice grew more desperate, objections more frequent, but it was clear the tide had turned. The courtroom could feel the scales of justice tipping, and this time they were tipping in the right direction. When Marcus finally called for closing statements, the atmosphere was electric. The prosecution summarized the witnesses' stories, the video evidence, and the undeniable pattern of misconduct. The defense tried to paint the officers as overworked men just doing their jobs, but the words fell flat against the mountain of truth that had been revealed. And as Marcus prepared to deliver his decision, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. The officers sat rigid, eyes fixed on him, knowing their future rested in the hands of the man they had underestimated. The man they had treated like nothing at a gas station was now the one deciding everything. The courtroom was silent, every pair of eyes fixed on Judge Marcus Williams. You could almost hear the collective heartbeat of the room as he adjusted his glasses and looked down at the two officers. The same men who had cuffed him, mocked him, and laughed in his face just one night earlier now sat in front of him with slumped shoulders and pale expressions, waiting for his decision. The irony was so sharp it could cut glass. Marcus paused for a long moment before speaking, letting the weight of the silence sink in. He wasn't stalling. He was gathering himself, making sure his words carried the gravity they deserved. Finally, his deep voice broke the stillness. This court has listened carefully to the testimony, examined the evidence, and weighed the conduct of the officers involved. His tone was calm, measured, but every word echoed with authority. He spoke about the role of law enforcement in society, about the sacred trust placed in officers who are sworn to protect and serve. With that responsibility, he said, comes the expectation of fairness, restraint, and respect for the citizens you encounter. When that trust is violated, it doesn't just harm the individual in front of you, it erodes confidence in the entire system. The officers shifted uncomfortably, their eyes fixed on the floor. The spectators sat perfectly still, hanging on every word. Marcus went on, his words striking with precision. He reminded the courtroom that justice wasn't just for the powerful or the privileged. It was for everyone, rich or poor, young or old, black or white. The law, he said, does not bend to ego. It does not excuse prejudice, and it does not turn a blind eye to abuse of authority. It would have been easy for Marcus to use this moment for revenge, easy to call out what they had done to him the night before, easy to humiliate them as they had humiliated him. But that wasn't who he was. Instead, he chose the higher ground. He never once mentioned his own arrest. He never exposed the personal irony of the moment. He let the evidence and the voices of the victims stand on their own. That in itself was the most powerful statement he could make. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Marcus delivered his ruling. This court finds the officers guilty of misconduct. Effective immediately. You are suspended without pay pending further review and disciplinary action. Your badges are not shields to hide behind, and this city will not tolerate abuse of power. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Some spectators nodded in satisfaction. Others whispered to each other. But all of them knew they had just witnessed something extraordinary. The two officers sat frozen, disbelief etched on their faces. Just 24 hours earlier, they had been laughing as they handcuffed Marcus Williams at a gas station. Now their careers and reputations lay in ruins, decided by the same man they had dismissed as just another suspect. Marcus struck the gavel, the sharp crack echoing through the chamber. Court is adjourned. With that, he rose from the bench, his black robe flowing as he walked toward the door. The room buzzed with energy, but Marcus didn't linger. He didn't smile, didn't gloat, didn't even look back. He carried himself with the same quiet dignity he always had, leaving behind a courtroom full of people who would never forget what they had just seen. As news of the case spread, the story traveled far beyond the courthouse walls. Local reporters picked it up first, then national outlets. The headlines were almost too perfect to be real. Cops arrest black man at gas station. Next day, he's the judge presiding over their hearing. Social media exploded with reactions. Some called it karma. Others called it justice. Most agreed it was a powerful reminder of why accountability matters. But for Marcus, it wasn't about the headlines. It wasn't about personal vindication. It was about something bigger. He had been given the chance to prove that justice wasn't about revenge. It was about fairness. And in choosing restraint over retaliation, he showed the true meaning of his role. At home that night, as he finally sat down in his living room, Marcus thought back to the gas station, to the cold cuffs on his wrists, to the sting of being dismissed and degraded. Then he thought of the courtroom, of the witnesses who had finally been heard, of the officers who had been held accountable. The contrast was stark, but the message was clear. You never know who you're dealing with. The man you mock, the person you dismiss, the stranger you think you can bully, might just be the one who holds you accountable tomorrow. And justice, though sometimes delayed, always has a way of coming back around. The story of Judge Marcus Williams became a symbol, not just of irony, but of hope. Hope that the system could correct itself. Hope that truth could prevail, and hope that, no matter how dark the night, the morning could bring justice in its purest form.